So Criss, I want to start out with you. Harvard Business Review recently had an article asking the provocative question in the headline, CFOs don't worry enough about cyber risk. Do you, as a CFO, do you concur with that assessment? And if so, why?
Well, I always love the relative question. You don't do this enough, right? But look, we're all CFOs. Ultimately, we are directly or indirectly responsible for risk management. Cybersecurity is just recognizing that if you lose customer information, if you lose employee information, if you lose your fundamental IP, the buck proverbially stops with you. What is relative of enough is really the balance that you want to make between the dollars you spend and the risk that you're willing to absorb. I think any CFO who doesn't come to the problem with that type of assessment is the one who's not doing enough, and the one who does come to that point with that assessment is doing enough, as long as they are then orchestrating across the rest of the organization, predominantly partnering with your CIO or your CISO or your CTO to put that infrastructure in place, put that business process in place, and make sure that the culture of protecting those assets are permeated throughout the organization. That's my take on the Harvard piece.
What kinds of questions should finance chiefs? We have all these, those of us who are not CFOs have all these preconceived notions of what the CFO's role is. Bean counter, you know, they're asking about the cost and how can we get that cost down. Is that wrong, Sandra? And what are the questions that finance chiefs should be asking? What should they be bringing to the table when it comes to cybersecurity?
So they're always going to ask how much it costs. That's their job. There's always that bean counter element to that role, but often CFOs have to ask the same questions as the audit committee is going to ask. What is our vulnerability? How vulnerable are we? How exposed are we? And in terms of cybersecurity, that can mean different things depending on your threat profile. You might be a target for a large financial crime actor. You might have specific technology that's on the wish list of a nation state. Or you might be a mid-market player who's not going to have a targeted attack, and you need to have cyber hygiene, you need to have good patch management in order to mitigate your situation. So, the questions that need to be asked really have to do with who are we as a company, how are we vulnerable, and are we taking the right steps to mitigate the risk?
Kumud, what, in your view, what kinds of, why is it that we have actually had to bring this conversation? How has it changed, right? 5, 10 years ago, were CFOs in the room when there were discussions around cyber breaches, when there were discussions around how we are at risk? And how has that changed, and why has it changed?
I think there's a difference between being in the room and being present in the room when that conversation is going on. So I think 10 years ago, cybersecurity was definitely different than it is today. And I think a lot of CFOs had that sort of wishful thinking of, but it won't happen to me. And I think even maybe 5 years ago, probably couldn't say that anymore. Because I think with things like hacktivism and more sort of indiscriminate targeting, anybody can be a target. And so there used to be this thought that only certain types of companies are going to be targeted by hackers or foreign governments. It's no longer the case. Now, the tools that are available are so automated and cheap and powerful that anybody is a target at any time.
I actually think this is one of the most important points to internalize for this group, because when you think about it over time, put yourself back 5, 10 years ago, you had a perimeter-based environment, right? You had managed devices which were fundamentally locked down. They were laptops, smartphones, right? In today's world, we've got the introduction of IoT devices in a campus environment. Every CIO that you'll talk to will recognize you have absolutely a flat network across your campus IT, your data center, even to the virtualized assets or applications you put into Amazon Web Services or Azure. And you've got your operational technology network, which are fundamental to your revenue streams. whether you're in a manufacturing organization or a shipping organization. And so those threats now become, with NotPetya and with WannaCry and the ransomware, a recognition that as a CFO, your network has fundamentally changed. It is about the identity of the network, where Okta spends so much time giving kind of that next generation of identity of the user, and the access to applications, where SailPoint has been so disruptive about understanding that facet of the network. And then where ForeScout plays, the identity of the devices, and then constantly and continually giving visibility to those devices and making sure they stay in the swim lane. The recognition that the threat vectors are exponentially larger just in the last 5 years. Therefore, your need to put together kind of the best of breed different security solutions and have them integrate and actually have them in an automated fashion be able to respond to the new threats. Those are some fundamental changes that if you're not close to the cybersecurity space like we are, if you're in your CFO capacity in a different industry, you just may not be as aware of. Those are the conversations to be having with your CIO partner.
When you were walking on stage, I was sharing the 5.2 trillion figure that Accenture put on the value at risk over the next 5 years. Spending on cybersecurity is on pace to grow to something north of $170.5 billion in the next couple of years, from about 123 in 2018. That's from Gartner. Breaches on average result in a stock drop of 5%. All of these numbers, they can become, we can sort of get lost in the, the enormity of these numbers. Maybe for you, Kumud, what are we adequately measuring the financial cost to companies of of breaches, of ways that our networks are being compromised, and what needs to change maybe in the way we are measuring the financial impact?
No, I'm just a bits and bytes guy, not necessarily the guy who counts the dollars. I don't know how that number gets computed, but it's certainly going to get used a lot in FUD, coming at companies about they're not doing enough and look at the risk and there's a risk of loss. So I think sensationalist or headlines like that get used in sensationalist ways, are going to be shared widely. I think the cost, you never really know the true cost of some kind of compromise or breach where there's been data loss. There's obviously reputational loss, there's the cost to remediate. Those are sort of some costs you can get your arms around and say, all right, we know it cost us this much to clean up the mess. But what about the long-term damage to your reputation? What about the customers you lost that will never come back? Can you really quantify all of that when it has such a long-term effect? I don't know. So whoever came up with that 5.2 trillion numbers probably put some big plugs in there for those kind of things. And I think there's also a sort of a weakening of belief and trust that happens not just in the company that was compromised, but in their peer group as well. If all the banks are weak, can I trust any of them? If a big one goes, aren't they all the same, right? So who counts that cost, that there's a lack of trust now? And if there's a foreign state, actor behind some of these compromises or attacks, right, then people don't know how to address that, right? So there's a weakening of trust happening, and I think, how can you count the cost of that? Because we depend on that for so much of what we do within a capitalist, well-regulated democracy. I
think it's important, though, to think of it as a "I've already been breached" kind of attitude, not a "I wonder if I'm ever going to get breached. I hope I won't." Assume breach is probably the best way to approach that kind of problem, and the reason is that you will then get oriented to the real problem. It's not if you get breached. Just like if somebody rushes the guards, it's not the fact that they just rush the guards to get in. Do they know what room to go into? Do they know the safe and the combination to the lock? Do they know how to get out without getting detected, just to use a building as a metaphor? You can measure business impact and assume you're going to get breached as a much more, I think, mature attitude about the risk that you're mitigating with cyber threats. So assuming that At some point, you're going to be breached. Actors need time. They need time to move laterally. They need time to escalate privileges. They need time to be able to extract or monetize. You have a chance, once a breach happens, to manage the risk. Some things that you can do to make this scenario not a nightmare scenario is to be prepared, right? Do you have your retainer for your IR services in place? Have you tabletop, exercised with your executives to know what are the next steps going to be? How you speak publicly about it, that's going to be another way that you can create a smaller problem for yourself rather than a huge crisis.
When it comes to spending on cybersecurity, the statistics show that on average companies, so of an IT budget that accounts for about, 3 to 7% of revenue, of what is being spent on IT, it tends to be in the range of 5–6%. Again, that's on average. It goes to cybersecurity. Where are we over-investing and where are we under-investing? We talked when we were speaking earlier about, you go to the big cybersecurity conferences and it can be this, a bit of a zoo, I think is the phrase that some people have, someone used. Where are we misspending? We'll stay with you, Sandra.
Well, it's really impractical. I think what CFOs always want to know the return on investment, right? So I'm going to be asked to spend X amount of money on this, and they really need to believe that they're making good purchases. Every year there's going to be new tech, there's going to be a new shiny thing. One way to look at it, or a rubric to use when you're looking at purchasing, because frankly, look, we're spending a lot more money and nothing is changing. Right. So your security systems have to be able to evolve to the threat. As the head of the intelligence organization at FireEye, I look at bad guys. I look how they change their tactics. I watch them evolve. They're always innovating. They're changing up. If you have to rip out your tech stack every year to put something new in, you're never going to get there. So your decision-making rubric when you are going to make a big investment in security really has to be about it. Is this system going to adapt to a moving target? The threat is going to change. Can my security team keep up? Can my security technology keep up? And can it evolve as the actors evolve? Because one place I do disagree, a previous speaker was talking about robots versus robots. It's actually people versus people. There's somebody on the other side of the keyboard who's innovating, who has creativity, and unfortunately they're a bad guy. And they're really smart. It's unfortunate that they're evil, because we would probably all want to hire them with their creativity that they show. So again, the rubric is, can my security keep up with the threats, change with them, and can my security team do the same?
Criss, Kumud, are we adequately measuring the effectiveness of the tools that we are using to combat compromises and breaches?
I think when we talk about where's the money going, you have to think about fundamentally what are you trying to do. And I think there's this circle that at its basic elements is very simple. We're trying to prevent bad things happening. The things that get through our defenses, we then have to detect them, right? Detect them and then respond. And then we take our learning and we put it back into strengthening our defenses to prevent. So that's a circle that we're all trying to do. Any security stack that you've got in place, any security system is trying to do that. But the money all seems to be disproportionately going to the detect and respond. So I think if you could do more on the prevent and make the prevention automated, you've got much better balance of where your effort and cost is being invested and what your efficacy is. And I think that's fundamentally different to how people have been doing security for decades. So I think as the tools get smarter and the threats get smarter, that basic cycle hasn't really changed, and where the investment's going hasn't really changed. That's why things aren't really getting better. So even though companies are spending more and they're getting more and more tools, they're still getting compromised, they're still getting breached, they're still in the headlines for the wrong reasons. And so I think people have to reevaluate how they're going about security, and are they correctly balancing their investments between those parts of that cycle I just described.
Criss, I'd like to pivot to a discussion of disclosure and information sharing. And when we think about preventing compromises and keeping our systems safe, there seems to be a good amount of regulation and rulemaking around what to disclose and when to disclose it when customer data is exposed and compromised. But a lot of these breaches are targeted at, as I understand it, what my company's doing internally, not necessarily what's affecting the customer. Are we disclosing? Are the rules around this sufficient that we're disclosing enough early on about what happens internally at companies, especially in a world where the US and many countries believe that foreign actors are very actively trying to get at our IP?
I'm not sure that I have a good insight on this question. If I compartmentalize the world between a customer breach information, there's definitely a lot of regulation around that, and it's a difficult balance between getting enough insight to be able to communicate and perhaps taking too much time to perfect the insight to communicate. And I think there's a little bit of art and contextual insight to every breach. I also think, and we've hit upon that, and you alluded to it, that so much more of the threats that we will see into the future are ransomware-based, are disruptive or to your revenue stream type of basis, or are just acts of war to bring down critical infrastructure. Right? That's, I think, what the next chapter will be based about. And I'm not sure that a regulatory improvement will have any influence in there. Sandra probably has a better insight on this topic than I do.
Well, it reminds me of a group we call APT38. It's believed to be North Korean-sponsored group. And interestingly, they could stay, and their dwell time in the environment could be up to 2 years. And they're watching, and they would learn. They knew that these PDFs are downloaded by this person. They know where the approvals are. They know that this financial person is supposed to approve this, and then it goes here. They paid so much attention to the inner workings of what's going on. And then just for good measure, once they extracted the money, then they deployed destructive malware on the way out. And why? To distract you. So your security team is now wondering why all the data is disappearing, and they're focused here. And on the other side, the money's being exfilled somewhere else. Right? So these groups are very sophisticated in what they do. And in case you're wondering, was this, was it just in certain countries? No, APT38 was targeting all over the place. The geopolitical backdrop was, creating a need for North Korea to find funds elsewhere. And so they were finding, vectors wherever they could. So the internal workings of your company are so important because when they're exposed, people can then use them to look just like normal operations. And as the head of intelligence, I'm usually giving really bad news and scaring people. But in this case, APT38 is a great example of why the inner workings are so important to protect.
But on that topic, is the threshold for many companies in terms of disclosure and in terms of just information sharing, Kumud, is it too high?
So I think you have to balance disclosure with making sure you don't make a bad situation worse.
Okay.
So I think there is some balance between you have a duty to your employees, customers, stakeholders to let them know what's happened, but you have to have the situation contained enough and make sure it doesn't hurt anybody else. And so there could be a tension there between early disclosure and late disclosure based on making sure you're not causing more damage. But I think, companies have always had disclosure issues, and it doesn't have to be about cyber. There's always been product recalls and situations like that. So I think it's an old issue, but it's got more teeth now with regulations requiring certain disclosures within certain intervals and maybe penalties for lack of disclosure or late disclosure. But I don't think it's a new issue. There are lots of new issues, but that's not one of them.
Well, maybe we can drill down on some of what those are in the few minutes we have. I want to talk about a subject that we are spending a lot of time writing about, we and our counterparts at other publications, and that's Huawei. And we're in the midst of, the U.S. is in the midst of prosecuting a case against Huawei that involves many things, including the alleged theft of intellectual property. There are those who have looked at this case and said, look, this is a half-decade old. These are instances that have been resolved already in civil courts, and that the U.S. case against Huawei is, in the words of one researcher, flimsy. Sandra, does that resonate with you, or do you feel, based on the insights that you've been able to glean, that Huawei and companies like it really are a threat to our intellectual property, U.S. intellectual property?
Well, I don't have the particulars on the details of the case against Huawei in this particular circumstance. But what we do see is that, look, these geopolitical events are driving a lot of Chinese cyber activity. The good news is, though, that with the Obama-Xi agreement that occurred a couple of years ago, we observed actually Chinese activity against commercial companies in the United States to plummet, right? So there was a diplomatic, in our view, a diplomatic effect that was positive, where we saw a drastic drop in Chinese cyber activity against U.S. companies. That being said, we watched an increase of Chinese cyber activity, Chinese-sponsored activity in other parts of Asia and in the world. So what does that tell me? Look, we don't have to be theoretical when we look at threats that are coming out. We see forensic evidence. We look at it very carefully. We look at, we have responders that go in. They have the malware. They know what's going on. So it's not a mystery, right? There is a threat. It comes from many different countries, including Chinese-sponsored groups. So in that way, I would say, we have to not give up, though, on the diplomatic process, because we've seen that it can work. We know the threat is there. We know diplomacy has a role, and it'll be interesting to see how it goes.
How does the trade war? How does we're prosecuting a trade war right now against China. Criss, do you have thoughts on the potential ways that can help or hinder the cause of protecting U.S. national security, particularly when it comes to cyber threats?
Look, the potential for escalating trade war, I think, is a fairly macro topic in and of itself, to the point of the derivative of conflict that arises. Absolutely. Look, the next real wars are going to be cyber. That we've already kind of seen that. The exposure of all of our commercial and public networks, and I think as a country right now, we're focused on a couple of the wrong priorities. Those are our risk areas, and I don't say that as a vendor who provides solutions to that marketplace, but as a citizen saying, we've got some fundamental exposure problems. The tension is escalating. The midnight hour, we're at the 2-minute mark. These all kind of feed into the same stew of escalating tensions that are developing. Without making it too much of a political conversation, yeah, I think that the warfare threat within a cybersecurity is a real risk. We've seen in the Ukraine and other areas where full electrical grids come down and the disruption. We know we have exposures within the financial industry. Even within the U.S. Fed on the civilian side, right, the continuous diagnostics and mitigation program is about understanding every facet of their network. On the DoD side, the mandate for Comply to Connect, which is about visibility and control of your entire network. That is the battlefront that has the highest probability of creating mass problems for the economy and for the country.
Kumud, are we on the cusp of a technological Cold War? Are we already in it? In the same way that, when I was growing up, we always talked about the threat of thermonuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union. Has the conversation shifted, or should it shift more?
I mean, when you talk about war, you generally think of nation states, right, combating each other. And I think, the definition now is so broad because if you take down corporate targets, are you still prosecuting a nation-state war? Quite possibly, you've changed that landscape. So a traditional theater of war or battle, dependent on sort of military and arms and things, that's really an out-of-date way of examining what's going on. The assets today tend to be digital and increasingly are going to become digital. And so you can defeat, a nation state without sending a soldier into a traditional theater of war, without using traditional weapons, but you can have equally devastating results economically, crippling physical infrastructure, as we just heard from Criss. So I think there's lots of things that can be done cheaply and with lethal consequences, but without entering into a traditional battlefield scenario. And so, we've seen some aspects of that. I think it's got a lot more to run because it does level the playing field. You don't have to own nukes to have the power to shape what's happening globally. And so, yeah, there's a lot of possibility there, and we haven't seen it yet.
In the last few seconds, Sandra, we hear more and more talk about the emergence of two internets. Is the outcome here going to be a world where we truly do have the internet that most of us are accustomed to, and a completely separate one that's completely closed off from the rest of the world? And what does that mean for things like information sharing and the kinds of cooperation that one might think we need to have with China?
Well, I think that, we used to talk about things like sovereignty in terms of territorial borders. I have sovereignty because if you come over that line, you're now in my territory. But we often don't talk about sovereignty in terms of the information space. So countries like Russia and China and other places, they have a different way of thinking about sovereignty. They include the information space within that domain. So when we try to have free commerce or something like that, we are doing this in a very, in a way that is very, very American-based, let's say, because we want to have a split between government and commercial. We want to do all these things. That's not the way that everyone else in the world is operating, right? So I think that, just for CFOs that are looking at this situation, I think the important thing to think about is now, with globalization, geopolitical events are going to drive risk. Geopolitical events are going to drive security spend. And the rubrics that we use when we are looking at these now have to be much more complex. They have to take into account not just the technology, but how, you have more in common now, I think, with military commanders than in any other time, because you're now looking at threats all over the world. You need intelligence, you need technology, and you need people. And I think that that's a very different world than maybe our parents who might have been in CFOs. They didn't have to worry about these types of things. So it's a new world in a completely different space.
And a big job for all of you. Please join me in thanking our guests today.